I'm Laura Shelton and I'm a partner in the Healthcare Regulatory team at HCR Law. I'm joined by my fellow partner and colleague, Paul Ridout, who is, I think we can say, a veteran expert in the field of adult social care. Paul and I have worked together for coming up for 10 years now, and it's fair to say he's taught me everything I know about adult social care and everything I don't know. We're here together today to have a little chat actually about his career and how he came to become such an expert in this field. Paul, just a few questions to begin with. Were you personally motivated to get involved in the care industry, or did it happen by chance?
Absolutely not motivated in advance, Laura. It happened by chance. It happened when I was what was called then an articled clerk, a hateful word now, but anyway, I was that, and I was acting towards the end of my period in training for somebody who was buying one of the few nursing homes in central London. We completed that transaction and it went badly wrong because the regulatory aspect, which was pretty thin in those days, but it was all completely wrong and non-existent, even though the fee was £1 to be registered. Imagine that. Anyway, so I had to unscramble all that, so I got to know the ins and outs of the then legislation, which was the Public Health Act of 1936, not changed a great deal, and that led me to become involved. My clients became trade association leads. They asked me to act for the trade association, and it started from there. When if you'd asked me when I was at university if that would be my dream, the answer would have been categorically no. But you have to take and run with what comes, don't you?
I think I found out recently that actually your dream was to be a tax whiz, is that right?
That would have been my dream, and of course that would have been bad news because they're not particularly well thought of anymore. Better off in adult social care, better off with bed knobs and broomsticks.
Well, indeed. And back to care homes. How were care homes perceived in the early days of your career by the service users, the public, and also relevant professionals?
They were very different from the way they are now. There weren't many of them. They were pretty much all publicly run. They were residential care homes, then known as rest homes, were basically hotels for old people who wanted to go and live with other old people. And nursing homes were homes for people who had minor healthcare difficulties, but wanted to live in a nice manor house in the country or something like that. And they were all privately funded, although there was provision under the legislation of 1948 for local authorities to provide that sort of care. They didn't tend to do so. And there was an expectation, because even though the law had changed to say that only married partners and children had responsibilities until the late 1970s, people looked after their old folk. You know, I remember people coming in with a 10-bob note to contribute to Granny's care in the care home, and it went on that way. They were not really understood in the healthcare environment, and they were nice old people, often lampooned in television shows. There was one particular one in which they claimed that they'd take over the care home from the owner. That would not be the case now.
You've worked in the industry now for, I think, over 50 years. What's the single most memorable thing that you've come across?
Well, I think I'm going to say two. Early on when the government started to encourage local authorities to pay for care, there was an explosion in the existence of care homes from about 1978 through to 1985. And the budget, which was then funded through central government, Department of Health and Social Security, something called supplementary benefit. And the local care homes put the prices up about 3 times a year. And the budget for the central government grew until it came to the attention of the then Prime Minister, the famous, infamous, however you like to describe her, Margaret Thatcher, and she said she wasn't having that, so she put a cap on the fees, and that dramatically changed, was probably the moment, and then Mrs. Thatcher moved the liability to local authorities, which was her twin hate, and it became very difficult from then. But to answer your question directly, I think the single biggest thing was the movement to central national regulation from the Care Standards Act 2000, which came into force in 2002. And prior to that, I mean, I had acted for regulators, and I had acted for people who, not people who were residents in care homes, but I'd acted for some authorities and mainly for people who ran care homes. And one got to know the local registration team, and it was good. I mean, even if we didn't act for them, everybody knew them. They dropped in for a cup of tea. There was a very personalised effect, and the local team knew the local provision. And that all suddenly went out of the window, because all those established teams, maybe in a health authority, maybe 4 or 5 people maximum, suddenly became a national body. And that changed everything completely. And, you know, I think if I had my wish, maybe you'll ask me that at the end, I'd like to go back to see localised and dedicated teams where there were real individual relationships between inspectors and providers. I think it worked better. And I think people got on, everybody knew where they were.
There is, of course, a consultation out at the moment on what providers would like to see happening with the change in regulations. In terms of legal practice generally in the social care industry, how do you think that's evolved across your 50-year career, and do you think it will continue?
Oh, massively. Nobody knew anything about it when I started in 1972, 75. I mean, it was regarded as something that goes on after we've done the conveyance. I mean, large buildings being bought by people to run as nursing homes was good bread and butter for conveyancing lawyers. They didn't really want to know and were frightened about everything that happened inside the care home. So there was a gap. And when public funding came with the Callaghan government at the end of the 70s, there was an increasingly complex public revenue, like tax. When I wanted to be a tax lawyer, I was then acting on the other side of how do you construe similar legislation that was codifying and exemplifying the way in which you could claim benefits. And we did a lot of work in front of Social Security benefit appeal tribunals. There was a gap in the market. Nobody really knew what to do. And I was a sole practitioner then, and I made the decision that I would just go anywhere, anytime, across the length and breadth of the country, usually England, sometimes Wales, very occasionally Scotland and Northern Ireland, but we would go everywhere and meet that need because the local lawyers were not fulfilling that need. And that's where it came from, and that's where a sort of a modicum of reputation came from.
And thinking about where we are now, how do you think the practice will continue to evolve? I mean, clearly we can still get everywhere with the advent of Teams and you know, remote work becoming much more normalised after the pandemic. But how do you
that's
see
much
things
better,
evolving?
isn't it? I mean, travelling 300 miles in a day and back is not a particularly viable way of going on. There's always going to be a regulator. Back in the 90s, there was an assessment of what do people think about regulation, where do they think regulation should come from. And I think there was one person out of 500 that suggested there shouldn't be any regulation at all. There will always be regulation, and there will always be a need to challenge that regulation or support vigorous action by regulators. After all, we're talking about the care, support and healthcare needs of some of the most vulnerable people in society. And you're talking about change. I mean, when I started out, people in care homes drove sports cars. They went to the pub and they went away on foreign holidays. Now they're lucky if they can get out of bed. The level of dependency, the level of acuity, and the level of sheer human suffering has moved. I mean, if you put it in terms, we used to talk about people staying in a nursing home for 2 years and in a residential care home for 5 years. Now they stay in a residential care home for a year to 18 months and in a nursing home anything from 2 days to 6 months. These are places of very high acuity in very great need, and they need to be regulated, but that regulation needs to be supportive,
Yeah, I think
not negative.
it needs to work in a way that works for the people that use the services as well as the providers, and I think that's where hopefully we'll see some positive change coming out of, you know, the consultations,
Well,
etc.
I hope so.
Thinking about your specialist practice and Ridouts joining HCR's full service healthcare team, what benefit has that brought?
Well, it brings huge benefits because we were specialised. People came to us in large numbers, I'm glad to say, to cope with our expertise with the regulator, to cope with our expertise in collecting public sector fees, largely from local authorities, and those sorts of things. But there were a host of other things: employment law issues, deals, real estate deals, corporate deals, health and safety, a whole the wide range of a full-service law firm. And our clients are enormously enriched having available to them a full-service law firm that can be pulled in at the touch of a button. So we can assemble a team of individual experts within a morning, rather than having to either educate other people's lawyers or look around for somebody who might be prepared to take on something a bit difficult.
Yeah, it's definitely of benefit to clients.
Absolutely of benefit to the clients and of benefit to the team.
Paul, what do you think is the single biggest challenge facing providers today?
Well, if we divide providers into those who are fortunate enough to have their services populated by those with enough money to pay the going rate for first-class service, and the others who are dependent, sadly, on state support. Let's take the latter part first. Without a shadow of a doubt, the pressures on government, financial pressures which get worse and worse, and that squeeze on local authorities who are the principal funders of social care. I mean, it's said now that 75% of a social services authority's budget is spent on care service and care home fees. So, and those fees are inadequate to meet standards of care that we find in the private pay sector, and inadequate to meet the needs that many people would expect. So you have a degree of vocational spirit. The people running care homes know and more or less accept that they're not going to get the fees that they need to provide the best service, but they can still do that and they can still make ends meet so long as they get support. But now we've got, and people, baby boomers like me have by and large benefited from the growth in real estate. So they sort of have £200,000 or £300,000 readily available to pay for the sort of for the sort of fees in these wonderful luxurious palaces. But down at the other end, you've got people with growing acuity, with growing need, and a squeeze, and frankly a lack of desire in young people to see social care, particularly residential social care, as a future, even short term. When you get more money stacking shelves in a supermarket than you do looking after the relative needs of aging population. So it's tough, and there's got to be, you're going to ask me that, but one of the biggest changes we need to see is a properly funded career structure, so that talented people who are drawn to looking after their vulnerable older people, whether it be in old age, or we mustn't forget those with learning difficulties and those with mental health problems. Mental health problems, as in every other part of healthcare, are heavily neglected. So we need to see attractive career packages which will take the best and the brightest to say, you know what, I'd like to do that for my career. I'd like to work through, I'd like to start off, doing work experience in a care home and winding up as being the manager of a care home or a group of care homes. And the money has got to be found somewhere to get people attracted. Lots of people are attracted vocationally, but they've also got to live and enjoy their lives.
I wondered if I could ask you, there is obviously a lot of change on the horizon with the Care Quality Commission, the regulator who we deal with, on the most frequent basis, I would say. Are you optimistic about positive change coming out of all of the negative? I'm
always optimistic, Laura. You can only get along in life, or certainly in any form of legal practice, by being optimistic. You've got to be optimistic to think you might win a case that is perhaps stacked with difficulty. But of course I'm optimistic, and the fact that it's going to remain, and the fact that there is a huge appetite for investment. We're seeing more and more external investment, perhaps from overseas, perhaps from the States, from all over. They are anxious to invest, but they're investing in the top end.
Sure.
We've got to see a channel of revenue stream that will attract investors to invest in that middle or lower middle market where people can't afford to pay for themselves from their established resources. But as a country who prides ourselves on libertarian approaches, we don't want to see people with high acuity sort of lying about the streets. They've got to be looked after, and they've got to be looked after properly, and there's got to be a proper stream. But until, perhaps, I mean, one of my hopes would be that social care could be seen as the important partner of healthcare and not as a Cinderella service. And I fear, sadly, that, and although this ought to change, but we sadly see that, I mean, people in care home, people resident in care homes don't vote. And that will always be at the back of the mind of those who are in a political cycle that changes so rapidly and so frequently. But I mean, I am optimistic, yes. It's still here.
Yeah.
It's still here. 54 years on, it's still going, and it's not going anywhere.
Well, and I think it will be. We talk about an ageing population and, you know, the change in demographic and the change in needs. So I think, yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think there's lots on the horizon. There's lots for providers to prepare for. But I think, you know, health and social care particularly, may come to us all. And so it needs to be invested in and on parity
Well, it
with...
will come to us all.
Yeah, it